The knock comes at noon, splitting the day in two. Before it, there was the quiet hum of a house at peace, the scent of yeast from the morning's bread, the rhythmic drip of the laundry tub out back, the lazy buzz of a fly tracing patterns against the kitchen window pane. After it, there is only the sharp, hard sound of knuckles against wood, a sound that is not a request, but a demand. I dry my hands on my apron, the rough spun cotton a familiar comfort against my fingers. The floorboards of the hallway creak a protest under my worn leather shoes, a sound as familiar as my own breathing. For 5 years, these sounds have been the music of my life, the proof of my labor. This house, a place I did not build but have certainly made, is a living thing around me, and I am its heart, pumping life into its 5 rooms with boiled coffee, clean linens, and a set of rules as unbending as the winter ground. My hand is on the brass knob, cool against my skin despite the oppressive heat that bleeds through the door. I expect one of my boarders, perhaps young Tom Calloway, having forgotten his lunch pail again. I expect a traveler, dusty from the road, seeking a clean bed for a fair price. I do not expect the man who stands on my porch. He is tall, taller than the door frame, forcing him to stoop slightly. He is dressed in a fine, dark coat, the kind reserved for bankers or prosperous merchants, though the cut of it speaks of a tailor who understands the need for movement. His boots are polished to a high shine, but a fine layer of reddish dust coats the heels, the story of a long, hard ride. He holds a wide-brimmed hat in one hand, his knuckles clean and unscarred. This is not a man who earns his keep with his fists. He earns it with his mind. And that, I have learned, is often more dangerous. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, meet mine, and there is no warmth in them. Only business. He doesn't waste time on pleasantries. The sun is high and cruel, baking the dust of Main Street, and courtesy is a luxury it has burned away. "Pack your things," he says. His voice is deep, a low rumble that seems to vibrate in the wood beneath my feet. "Rent's due." The words are a blow, sharp and stunning. I feel the blood drain from my face, a cold tide in the sweltering heat. Rent. But rent isn't due for another week, and my landlord is Mr. Pike, a weasel of a man whose face is a permanent sneer, not this stranger who stands before me like a thundercloud. My voice, when I find it, is steady. It has to be. "I believe you have the wrong address. I am current with Mr. Pike." The man offers no smile, no flicker of apology for a potential mistake. He simply raises his other hand. In it, he holds a folded paper, an official-looking document from the courthouse. The heat has already begun to curl its edges. "Mr. Pike no longer owns this property," he states, his tone flat and final. "It was sold, tax auction." He unfolds the paper with a flick of his wrist. "The new owner is me." I stare at the paper. My eyes catch the bold, looping script of the county clerk. A man I know, a man who attends our church on Sundays. I see the heavy, embossed seal of the county, a mark of absolute authority. A writ, a legal document that feels as heavy and final as a tombstone. The words swim before me, a cruel soup of legal jargon. But the meaning is clear. Sold, already sold, without notice, without a word. The ground shifts beneath my feet, the solid foundation of my life turning to sand. A murmur draws my attention to the street. On the porch rail of the general store across the way, a small crowd has gathered. Martha Gable, whose tongue is the sharpest instrument in this town, is there, her arms crossed, her bird-like eyes missing nothing. Jebediah Hemlock, who has done little more than whittle and gossip for 20 years, leans against a post, watching the spectacle with a hungry look. They are vultures, smelling a carcass. My ruin is their afternoon's entertainment. I feel a tremor start in my hands, a deep, cellular vibration of fear and rage. I clench them into fists at my sides, willing the shaking to stop. It does. For now, I force myself to look back at the man. His gaze is still on me, but something in it has shifted. The cold, business-like assessment is gone, replaced by something I cannot name. It is not pity. It is something closer to recognition. He takes a half-step closer, lowering his voice so that the hungry ears across the street cannot hear the scent of leather and dust and something else, clean soap. Maybe reaches me. His voice drops to a whisper, a sound meant for my ears alone, and he speaks a single, impossible word. Wife. It hangs in the hot, still air between us, a question so absurd, so utterly out of place, that I wonder if the sun has finally cooked my brain. It is not a demand, not a lecherous proposal. It is a question, a lifeline, thrown in the most bizarre shape I could ever imagine. I stare at him, speechless. My mind, usually so quick to calculate and plan, is a blank slate. He must see the utter confusion on my face, because he continues, his voice still low and urgent. There's a legal maneuver, a stay. The seizure can be stalled if the property is part of a homestead claim. A wife's dower rights complicate the seizure of a primary residence attached to a claim. I control such a claim, just north of town. He speaks quickly, the words precise and clipped, as if he is explaining a business transaction. If you are my wife on paper, this house becomes an attachment to that claim. It buys you time. It puts the law on your side, for a change. My breath catches in my throat. A legal trick, a sham. He is proposing a fraud to combat a fraud. I look from his intense, serious face down to the paper in his hand. I see the seal on his deed, the proof of his claim. Then, my eyes drift past his shoulder. My heart sinks. Deputy Stroud is walking toward my house. He is a slow, methodical man, not unkind, but a servant of the law above all else. In his hands, he carries a coil of bright red ribbon. I know what that ribbon means. I saw it tied to the door of the blacksmith shop last year when the bank took it. It is the mark of seizure, a public declaration that everything within these walls no longer belongs to its occupant. He is untying the end of the ribbon, preparing to wrap it around the porch posts, to tie a bow on the end of my life as I know it. The choice is suddenly a physical thing, a weight pressing down on me. It is a pistol at my ribs. I can hold on to my pride, my independence, and be thrown out onto the dusty street with nothing but the clothes on my back, my borders scattered, my name ruined. Or I can gamble on this stranger's vow, on this desperate, insane plan that smells of deceit and danger. I find my voice, though it feels like a stranger's in my own throat. Why, I ask, the word barely a whisper. Why me? A flicker of something that looks like shame crosses his face, a shadow in those stormy eyes. He glances over at the gossips, then back at me. His answer is low and bitter, because the truth won't be enough by sundown. He knows, somehow. This man knows I have been cheated, that Pike has manufactured this crisis. He knows the law, as written, will crush me before I have a chance to fight. He is offering me the only weapon he has, a lie. A bigger, more complicated lie to fight the simple, brutal one that is about to unmake me. The heavy tread of boots on the porch steps breaks the spell. Deputy Stroud has reached the threshold. He nods at me, his expression one of grim duty. He doesn't look at the tall stranger, only at me, the woman he is about to make homeless. In his hand, he no longer holds the ribbon. He holds a heavy pair of iron cuffs and a thick bolt. Not for me, for my door. To chain it shut. To lock me out of my own life. He steps forward, onto the first plank of my porch, his shadow falling over me. The world shrinks to this single, terrible moment. The heat, the dust, the staring eyes of the town, the tall stranger with his impossible offer, and the deputy with the tools to end it all. The iron of the cuffs gleams in the merciless noon sun. What do I say 3 days earlier? The world was still a place that made sense. It was a world measured in the fine white dust of flour on my hands, in the comforting billow of steam from the laundry copper, in the neat, straight lines of my ledger. My world was this house, and I kept its 5 rooms breathing with the rhythm of my own work. Mornings began before the sun, with the sharp, clean scent of lye soap and the rich aroma of coffee boiling on the stove. By the time my 3 boarders, Mr. Henderson, a quiet bookkeeper, and the 2 young Hayes brothers, who worked at the livery, came down for breakfast, The table would be set with a platter of hot biscuits, a bowl of gravy, and the promise of a day that was just like the one before it. Predictable, orderly, mine. The rules of my house were simple and unyielding. No boots past the entryway, no loud talk after 9 o'clock. Accounts settled every Saturday. In cash, in return. I gave them clean sheets, mended shirts, and a place that felt more like a home than a rented room. This house was my fortress, built not of stone, but of routine and relentless labor. It was my salvation after my husband. Samuel was taken by the fever 3 years back, leaving me with little more than his good name and a mountain of debts. I had clawed my way back, biscuit by biscuit, laundered sheet by laundered sheet, until this boarding house was a respectable, profitable enterprise. It was everything I had. Then the railroad men came. They arrived with their tripods and measuring chains, their confident talk of progress and a new line that would connect our small town of redemption to the wider world. A thrill ran through the town, a fever of speculation and hope. But for me, it was the beginning of the end, though I did not know it then. My landlord, Mr. Pike, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly and whose heart was a shriveled little raisin, saw the surveyors and his eyes lit with a particular kind of greed. He was a small man, perpetually smelling of stale tobacco and desperation. He came to me a week after the surveyors left, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his eyes fixed on a crack in my floorboards. "With the railroad coming, property values are set to skyrocket. A boom is coming. A real boom. I have to adjust the rent accordingly." He raised it by a third. It was a steep and sudden blow, but I did not argue. I reworked my budget, calculated how many extra loaves of bread I would need to sell, how many shirts I could take in for washing. I could manage. I would have to. 2 weeks later, he came back. "The investors from the East," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They are paying top dollar for any land near the proposed line. Top dollar. My own taxes will be ruinous. I'm afraid I have no choice." He raised the rent again. Another third on top of the first. This time, the number was a sharp, physical pain in my chest. It was no longer a challenge. It was an impossibility. It was more than the house could possibly earn. The bank letter arrived the following Monday. It was a cold, impersonal document, filled with legal terms that all meant the same thing. I was falling behind on the loan I had taken out to purchase the furniture and linens when I first opened the house. The numbers on the page were stark and brutal. They represented a hole I could not fill, a tide I could not turn back. I folded the letter into a small, tight square and hid it in the one place no one would ever look underneath the half-empty bag of sugar in my pantry. Out of sight, but never out of mind. It sat there like a lump of poison in the belly of my home. A few days later, I saw the vulture. His name was Cole Avery, a speculator from a bigger city to the east. He was the kind of man who wore a tailored suit and a diamond stick pin even in our dusty little town. He walked with an air of ownership, as if the whole world were his for the taking, and he was just deciding which piece to pick up first. I watched from my kitchen window as he stood in the back lot behind my property, the one that led down to the creek. He didn't use a measuring chain. He paced it off, heel to toe, a smug smile playing on his lips, as if he were measuring out his own kingdom. He never knocked on my door, never asked permission. He just looked, and his looking felt like a violation, a trespass on the life I'd so carefully built. The panic began to spread through redemption like a fever. It was a quiet, desperate thing. The first victim was the widow Dunleavy, who ran a small wash house in the alley behind my boarding house. She was a frail woman, worn down by years of hard work and sorrow. One morning, her little shop was shuttered. The talk at the general store was that she had sold it to Avery for less than half its worth. She had been behind on her taxes, and he had come to her with an offer that was more of a threat. "Take this now, or get nothing later." The fear was passed from hand to hand. A cold coin exchanged in hushed conversations over cracker barrels and quilting frames. Who was next? We all wondered. I was not a woman to surrender. I saw the trap Pike and Avery were laying, a neat little snare of debt and inflated rent designed to force me out. But I would not be forced. I decided to fight back with the only tool I had: work. I cleared out a small storage room, aired it out, and put a fresh coat of paint on the walls. I bought a second-hand cot and a small dresser. I would take in 2 more boarders. The house would be crowded. The work would be harder. But the income from 2 more beds would be enough to meet Pike's new, outrageous demands. 2 young cowhands, brothers named Jed and Silas, were happy for the room. They were honest, hard-working boys. Their faces burned brown by the sun, their hands calloused from rope and leather. They were polite and grateful, and they paid their first week's rent in advance with worn silver coins. I held the money in my hand, a small victory against the encroaching darkness. It was enough. I had bridged the shortfall. That Saturday, when Mr. Pike came to collect, I laid the full amount on the parlor table. He counted it slowly, his lips moving silently. Then he separated the coins paid by the 2 new boarders. He pushed their portion back toward me. "I won't be taking this," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "It's good coin, Mr. Pike. It's all there. The town council is discussing new occupancy ordinances," he lied, his gaze darting around the room, landing on everything but my face. "Overcrowding, fire hazards. I cannot, in good conscience, permit more than 3 boarders. For your own safety, of course. You will have to ask the 2 new gentlemen to leave." And there it was. It had never been about the money. It was about possession. He didn't want my rent. He wanted my house. My refusal to be broken had only made him more determined. The whispers started after that. I heard them from Mr. Henderson, who had overheard men talking in the saloon. The talk was that I was months behind on my rent, that I had been given multiple warnings, forged arrears. They were building a case against me, a fiction of debt and delinquency to justify what they planned to do. The whispers floated through the town like chimney soot, staining my name, poisoning the well of my reputation. The night before the knock, the threat became real. I was in the kitchen, darning a sock by the light of a single oil lamp. The house was quiet, my boarders asleep upstairs. It was a peaceful sound, the gentle rhythm of the needle weaving in and out of the wool. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound at the back door. The latch rattled. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't scream, I didn't even breathe. I slowly placed my sewing basket on the floor, my movements silent. I rose from my chair and reached for the heaviest thing I could find, the large, cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. It was heavy and solid in my hand, a familiar weight. I crept toward the back door, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks. The latch rattled again, more insistently this time. Someone was trying to force it. I stood to the side of the door, flattened against the wall. The skillet held high. I waited, my blood pounding in my ears. The door creaked open an inch, and a hand snaked through the gap, fumbling for the inside bolt. In that moment, all my fear boiled over into pure, hot rage. This was my home, my sanctuary, and they dared to invade it in the dead of night. I swung the skillet with all the strength I had. There was a sickening crunch of metal on bone, a sharp cry of pain, and the hand was gone. I heard a man curse, followed by the sound of footsteps scrambling away in the darkness, fading into the night. I slammed the door shut, shot the bolt home, and leaned against the wood, my body trembling. The heavy skillet still clutched in my hand. They had not gotten in. Not tonight. The next morning, I rose at the usual time. My hands were steady as I ground the coffee. As I mixed the biscuit dough, I would not show them my fear. I went to the front door to bring in the milk pail that was left on the stoop. As I bent down, I saw it. Tucked neatly under the doormat was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't the newspaper. It was a clean, white note. My stomach turned to ice. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and unfolded it. The message was written in a neat, clear hand. There were no pleasantries, no signature. Just 5 simple, chilling words. No sheriff if you vacate by Friday. The air in the hallway was thick with the scent of day-old biscuits and the metallic tang of fear. Before Eleanora Thompson stood 2 men, 2 futures, One was Deputy Stroud, a man she'd known for years, his face a mask of reluctant duty, the iron cuffs in his hand a symbol of a swift and brutal end. The other was a stranger, tall and severe, his low-voiced, impossible question wife hanging between them like a ghost in the noonday sun. Her world had shrunk to the space of this porch, a stage for her own ruin. Her mind, a well-oiled machine of calculation and planning, seized upon the only weapon a respectable woman possessed in the face of legal force hospitality. It was a flimsy shield, but it was the only one she had. "Deputy," she said, her voice betraying none of the tremor that shook her insides. "You look parched. The sun is fierce today. I have a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. You'll not do your duty on an empty stomach. Surely—" Stroud hesitated. He was a man of habit, and for 5 years, his habits had occasionally included a cup of Nora's strong, black coffee. The offer was a small, familiar courtesy in a situation that was anything but. It was a tug-of-war between duty and decency. He glanced at the impatient, whispering crowd across the street, then back at her. The tall stranger seized the moment of hesitation. He moved, not into her house, but to the side, placing himself slightly between her and the deputy. A subtle act of shielding. "A moment of your time. Deputy, this is a complex matter. Some new information has come to light. The only information I have is this writ," Stroud said, his voice firming up as he remembered his purpose. He held up the paper from the court. "It's legal and binding. Writs can be contested," the stranger said smoothly. "Even stayed. A cup of coffee seems a small price for ensuring the law is followed to its fullest, most proper extent." Nora didn't wait for the deputy's answer. She retreated into the cool dimness of her parlor, the familiar sight of the worn settee and the braided rug a balm to her frayed nerves. She moved with purpose, her hands steady as she fetched a cup and saucer. It was an act, a performance of normalcy in a world gone mad. When she returned, the tall man had stepped just inside the doorway, his presence filling the space, forcing the harsh sunlight to remain on the porch. He took the cup from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. They were cool and steady. He handed the coffee to the deputy. Stroud, caught off guard by the gesture, took it automatically. The immediate threat of the iron cuffs was gone, replaced by the mundane problem of holding a hot cup of coffee. Nora had bought herself minutes. The stranger turned his full attention back to her, his voice low again. "My name is Silas Boone." The name meant nothing to her. It was a solid, earthy name, the name of a farmer or a blacksmith. But then he added, his gaze unwavering, "Some folks in the territory have another name for me. They call me the River Buyer." That name, she knew. It was a name spoken in whispers in the general store, a name attached to stories of fortune and ruthless ambition. The River Buyer was a man who saw value where others saw only mud and reeds. He had come to the territory a few years back, they said, with nothing but a good horse and a keen eye. He didn't buy ranches, he bought the creeks that ran through them. He filed patents on water rights, on narrow, muddy riverbeds that ranchers had considered worthless. Then, when the dry season came, when the cattle were lowing with thirst, the man who owned the water owned everything. He was said to be richer than any cattle baron, his wealth built not on livestock, but on the one thing everything else depended upon. He was clever, and he was dangerous. "They say you are a rich man," Nora said, her voice a flat statement, not a question. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "I've been lucky." He dismissed his reputation with a wave of his hand, as if it were an irritating fly. His focus was entirely on the present, on the ticking clock that was Deputy Stroud sipping his coffee. "As I said," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial murmur, "the law has loopholes, Mrs. Thompson. A married woman has dower rights. If this property is legally attached to a primary homestead claim, it cannot be seized without a much more thorough review. A seizure can be paused, pending that review. My homestead, north of here, is a registered, patented claim, if you are my wife. This boarding house becomes a part of that claim. The writ becomes complicated. Stroud can't enforce it. Not today. He laid it out so simply. A legal equation designed to produce a single result time, but Nora had not survived this long by being naive. Men like Silas Boone, men who could bend the land and the law to their will, did not act out of charity. There was always a price. "This sounds like a trap," she said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You arrive on the day I'm to be evicted, with a writ that names you as the new owner, and you offer me this absurd proposal. Why should I believe you are not in league with Pike and Avery for the first time?" A flicker of something raw and genuine crossed his face. It was anger, tightly controlled but unmistakable. "Because I do not do business that way. And because I have this—" He reached inside his coat, not for a weapon, but for a slim leather billfold. From it, he produced a folded letter. It was not a courthouse document, but personal correspondence, written on the thick, creamy stationery of Judge Mercer himself. He held it so only she could see it. The handwriting was the judge's familiar, spidery script. It was not a long letter, but a few phrases leaped out at her. "Deeply concerned by the irregularities in the Pike ledgers, a pattern of predatory acquisitions. I urge you to look into the matter of the church trust. It was not proof of a crime, but it was a clear signal from the highest legal authority in the county that something was deeply wrong. It was a warning, and it was addressed to Silas Boone. The judge is a friend," Silas said, refolding the letter and tucking it away. "He is also a man of the law, and his hands are tied until a formal complaint is made. He cannot act on suspicion alone, but he can give a warning to a friend who he knows has an interest in seeing things done right. An interest Nora pressed. What is your interest in this?" "In me, my interest is the railroad," he said plainly. "I want it to come through redemption. It will be good for everyone. But I will not stand by and watch men like Pike and Cole Avery use the promise of progress as a club to beat honest people out of their homes. They are not clearing a path for the railroad. They are stuffing their own pockets. They are using a dummy trust, registered to the new church, to launder the titles. They bully people into selling for pennies, or they invent debts to have them evicted. Then they transfer the clean title to the trust. When the railroad corporation comes to buy the land, they will sell it at 100 times what they paid, and it will all look perfectly legal." He paused, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "They've done it to the widow Dunleavy. They are doing it to you, and there are 2 other women on this block who are next on their list. I want the railroad to pass. Mrs. Thompson. But I will not see it built on the backs of widows and working women." His words struck a chord of truth within her. It was exactly what she had suspected, but to hear it laid out so clearly, so confidently, was both terrifying and validating. He was not her enemy. He was the enemy of her enemy. But that did not necessarily make him her friend. A loud, impatient bang on the doorframe made them both jump. Deputy Stroud had finished his coffee. His face was set in a grim line. "Time's up," he announced, his voice booming in the quiet house. "I've been patient. Now, are you leaving, Mrs. Thompson, or am I locking this door from the street?" A voice, high and shrill like Martha Gable's, rose in a chant. "Open up, let's see the show." Other voices joined in, a chorus of bored, cruel townspeople hungry for drama. "Put her out. Open up." The walls of her home seemed to shrink, the air growing thin and suffocating. The gossip's chant was a drumbeat, counting down the last seconds of her life as she knew it. Silas Boone moved closer, until he was standing so near she could feel the heat radiating from him. His whisper returned, a lifeline in the storm. "Marry me for 30 days. That's all I ask. 30 days to give Judge Mercer the time he needs to open a formal investigation. We will expose Pike and Avery. You will keep your house. I will give you my word. When the 30 days are done, we will have the marriage annulled. You will be free. You choose. 30 days. It was a lifetime, and it was no time at all. An alliance, a contract, a lie to fight a lie." She looked past him, through the open door, at the jeering faces of her neighbors, at the deputy's determined expression, at the hard, unyielding line of the horizon. Then she looked at the man before her, the river buyer, a man of secrets and power, who was offering her a shield she could not have forged on her own. He was a gamble, the biggest of her life, but the alternative surrender was no longer an option. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. She did not look at Silas Boone. She looked directly at Deputy Stroud, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, cutting through the noise from the street. "You can put those cuffs away, Deputy," she declared, her words sharp and final. "We won't be needing them, Mr. Boone and I are riding to the judge's office. We're going to get a license." She held his gaze, a challenge in her eyes. Now, the ride to the courthouse was a silent one, suspended in a dreamlike state of unreality. Nora sat straight-backed on the mare Silas Boone had procured for her, her hands gripping the reins with a tightness that had nothing to do with controlling the horse. The world seemed both muffled and painfully sharp. She could feel the heat of the sun on her shoulders, the coarse fabric of her best dress against her skin, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather that marked time in this strange new chapter of her life. Beside her, Silas rode with an easy confidence, his posture relaxed but alert. He did not speak, and she was grateful for it. There were no words for the abyss that had opened at her feet, no language for the desperate leap of faith she had just taken. She had placed her life, her home, her very name, into the hands of a man she had met less than an hour ago, a man they called the river buyer. The courthouse was not a grand building. It was a simple, two-story structure of brick and timber, but it possessed the unassailable authority of the law. Its hallways smelled of old paper, beeswax from the polished floors, and the faint, acidic scent of ink. The air was cool and still, a welcome respite from the oppressive heat outside. At a tall wooden desk sat a clerk, a thin, sallow man named Abernathy, whose spectacles were attached to a crooked silver chain that hung lopsidedly from his collar. He peered at them over the rims of his glasses, his expression one of perpetual, weary disapproval. "The judge is in his chambers," the clerk stated, his voice dry as dust. "He is reviewing circuit dockets. He is not to be disturbed." Silas did not argue or raise his voice. He simply placed two documents on the clerk's desk, the writ of seizure with his own name on it, and the personal letter from Judge Mercer. "Mr. Abernathy's eyes scanned the writ with professional disinterest, but when he saw the judge's stationery and the familiar signature, his posture changed. A flicker of curiosity, and perhaps a little fear, crossed his face. He looked from Silas to Nora, then back again. "I will see if he is available." He sniffed and disappeared through a heavy oak door. They waited. The only sound was the loud, slow ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Nora stared at the pattern on the floor, focusing on the swirls in the wood to keep the panic from rising in her throat. This was real. This was happening. She was about to marry a stranger to save her home. The oak door opened again, and the clerk beckoned them in. Judge Mercer's chambers were a testament to a busy and burdened life. Books were piled on every available surface, maps were tacked to the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of old leather and cold pipe tobacco. The judge himself was a large man with a thick mane of graying hair, and eyes that seemed to have seen every form of human folly and desperation. He was not smiling. "Boone," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He nodded at Nora. "Ma'am." He gestured to two simple wooden chairs. "Sit." He held the writ in his hand, his thumb tracing the embossed seal. "I signed this myself this morning. It was presented by Mr. Pike's lawyer. The paperwork was in order. The arrears were documented, the notices of delinquency filed." He looked up at Nora, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "According to this, you are 3 months behind in your rent and have made no effort to pay." "That is a lie," Nora said, and the strength in her own voice surprised her. "I have never missed a payment. I have the receipts to prove it. Mr. Pike refused my last payment after he raised the rent to a level he knew I could not meet." Judge Mercer's eyes shifted to Silas. "And you, Boone, you bought the debt and the property at auction. A tidy piece of business. It was the only way to get a legal standing in the matter. "Judge," Silas replied, his tone respectful but firm. "You know as well as I do what Pike and Avery are doing." "Your letter was clear enough," the judge grunted, a sound of grim acknowledgement. He picked up Pike's ledger of arrears, which had been filed with the writ. He scanned the columns of numbers, his brow furrowing into a deep frown. He muttered to himself, tracing a line with his finger. "This arithmetic is creative. The interest calculations alone are predatory." He tossed the ledger onto his desk with a sound of disgust. "But it is a signed document, and for now, it is evidence. Proving fraud takes time." "Time," Silas said, "is what we've come to purchase." The judge leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. He looked from Silas's determined face to Nora's pale but resolute one. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the whole county. He pulled a fresh marriage license from a drawer. "This is a highly irregular solution to a property dispute. These are highly irregular times." "Judge," Silas said. Judge Mercer picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and began to fill out the form with a speed that was entirely unromantic. Names, dates, residences. It was a business transaction, nothing more. He slid the document across the desk toward them. "Sign here." Nora's hand trembled as she took the pen. The ink was a deep, definitive black. She wrote her name Eleanora Thompson for the last time. The signature was neat, practiced. The hand of a woman who ran a business, who kept ledgers, who understood the weight of a written contract. Silas signed after her. Silas Boone. His signature was strong and angular, like the man himself. "The vows are a formality," the judge said, his tone making it clear he had no time for ceremony. "But the law requires them to be spoken. Do you, Silas Boone, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do," Silas said, his voice steady. He turned to Nora, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "And do you, Eleanora Thompson," the judge continued, "take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" Nora's throat was as dry as a desert road. This was the moment, the final step over the precipice. She felt Silas's hand gently cover her own where it rested on the desk. His palm was warm and still, a solid, grounding presence in the spinning chaos of the moment. It was not a gesture of affection, but one of solidarity, an anchor. She drew a breath and looked the judge in the eye. Her voice, when it came, did not crack. "I do." Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory, Judge Mercer declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife." He did not smile. He immediately reached for another form and a heavy stamp. He signed the bottom of the new document with a flourish and brought the stamp down with a heavy, final thud that echoed in the quiet room. "This is a temporary injunction," he announced, sliding the paper toward Silas. "It stays the enforcement of the writ of seizure, pending a full judicial review of Mr. Pike's ledgers and the circumstances of the tax sale. Your wife's dower rights are now attached to your homestead claim. The property is protected. For now." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "This has bought you a battle. Boone, not the war. Avery and Pike will not take this lying down. Be careful." Outside, the sun was just as bright, the air just as hot, but the world felt entirely different. Nora felt a strange lightness, a dizzying sense of reprieve. She had walked into the courthouse a desperate woman on the verge of ruin. She had walked out a wife, Mrs. Silas Boone. The name felt foreign on her tongue. A costume she was wearing for a play she did not understand. As they reached their horses, a man stepped out from the shadow of the general store's awning. It was Cole Avery. He was dressed impeccably as always, his smile as sharp and polished as the diamond in his tie-pin. He tipped his hat to Nora, though his eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on Silas. "Well, Boone," Avery said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "I hear congratulations are in order. A whirlwind romance. I must admit, I didn't take you for the sentimental type." "What do you want?" Avery Silas asked, his tone flat. "Just wanted to invite you to have a drink," Avery replied, his smile widening. "To talk business. Now that you're a man of property in this town, I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. There's enough progress to make everyone rich. He was trying to buy him, to absorb him into his web of corruption. Nora watched Silas, holding her breath. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung himself up into his saddle. "My business," he said, looking down at Avery, "is with my wife." He reached down and offered a hand to Nora to help her onto her mare. The simple, public gesture was a declaration. Avery's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing. As they turned their horses to leave, he muttered, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still air. "You can't fence a flood." The ride back was different. The silence was no longer one of shock, but of shared tension. They had won the first skirmish, but Avery's threat hung between them, a promise of the deluge to come. As they rounded the corner onto Main Street, Nora's house came into view, and her heart sank. The simple, hand-painted sign that read "Room Supper" still hung from its post by the porch, but it was crooked, hanging by a single rope. The other had been slashed clean through with a knife. It was a petty, vicious act of vandalism. A message. They dismounted in silence. Silas took out his pocket knife and cut the sign down completely, leaning it carefully against the porch wall. "I'll fix it later," he said, his voice tight with anger. Nora's relief had evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They had been gone for no more than an hour. An hour was all it had taken for the enemy to strike back. She pushed open her front door. The house was quiet, too quiet. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool air inside. "Something's wrong," she whispered. She walked quickly to the kitchen, the heart of her home. Everything appeared to be in order. Then she went to the pantry, to the sugar tin. The bank letter was still there, but that's not what she was looking for. She reached behind a row of canned peaches for the heavy, leather-bound ledger where she kept all her accounts, all her receipts, all the proof of her solvency. It was gone. Her blood ran cold. She frantically searched the shelf, her hands knocking over tins and jars. It was not there. And then she saw them. On the clean-swept floorboards leading from the back of the pantry toward the cellar door, there were traces of mud, the distinct, damning outline of a man's boot prints. "They were in the house," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. Silas was beside her in an instant, his eyes following the tracks on the floor. He drew a pistol from a holster concealed inside his coat, the movement fluid and practiced. He motioned for her to stay back as he moved silently toward the cellar door. He eased it open. The dark, musty air of the cellar wafted up to meet them. Nothing. Nora, however, was not looking down into the darkness. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the cellar, a place she had always considered her last bastion of security, beneath a loose floorboard. Hidden under a stack of old potato sacks was a small, tin box. It held the original deed to the house left to her by her husband, his military service papers, the few pieces of her mother's jewelry she had left. It was her secret heart, the repository of her past and her only true treasures. The floorboard was askew. The potato sacks had been tossed aside. With a cry of dread, she rushed past Silas and down the rickety cellar steps. She fell to her knees in the dirt and pulled the tin box from its hiding place. The lid was not closed. It had been pried open, the metal bent and twisted, her hands shaking. She opened it. The jewelry was gone, but she barely registered its absence. Her husband's papers were scattered. And there, lying on top of them, was a document she had never seen before. It was a deed of sale. It was dated 2 weeks ago, and it was signed at the bottom, in a crude, shaky hand, with a single letter, Annex, her mark, a forged deed, selling her home to Mr. Pike for a pittance, with her own forged mark sealing the lie. The thin, wavering light of the oil lamp turned the kitchen table into an island of stark clarity in a sea of shadows. Here, in the heart of Nora's home, they laid out the weapons of their enemy. The cellar's damp chill still clung to the forged deed, and its counterfeit authority seemed to poison the warm, familiar air of the room. Across from it, Silas spread open the false ledger that Pike's lawyer had filed with the court, its pages unnaturally clean, its ink a uniform, dead black that shone with a mean light under the lamp's glow. This was a war of paper and ink, a battle to be fought in columns and signatures. Nora, a woman whose life was governed by her own meticulously kept books, felt a surge of cold, methodical fury. This was not just a forgery. It was a perversion of her life's work, an insult to the very principles of order and honesty by which she lived. "Look at the dates," she said, her voice low and steady. She pointed a finger, the nail still bearing a faint trace of flour from the morning's baking. "He claims I missed a payment in April, but here is the receipt for that month, signed by Pike himself." She had retrieved her own records, a bundle of worn, slightly greasy papers tied with a bit of twine. They were not pristine. They were documents that had lived in a working kitchen, bearing the occasional coffee ring or a dusting of flour, each stain a testament to their authenticity. Silas nodded, his gaze sweeping across the fraudulent document. "And the witnesses to your supposed delinquency," he murmured, tapping a spidery signature at the bottom of a page. "A Bartholomew Jones's and a Silas Croft. I've lived and worked in this territory for 5 years. I know every rancher, every storekeep, every hired hand with a name to him. These men do not exist. They were ghosts, conjured out of an inkwell to bear false witness against her. The deception was both clumsy and audacious. It was built on the assumption that no one would look too closely, that a woman alone would be too frightened and overwhelmed to challenge the authority of a stamped courthouse paper." Silas leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he studied the elegant, looping script that filled the ledger. It was too practiced, too perfect for a man like Pike, whose own signature was little more than an indecipherable scrawl. A flicker of recognition crossed Silas's face. He fell silent for a long moment. His eyes narrowed in concentration. "I know this hand," he said finally, the words heavy with certainty. He looked at Nora, his expression grim. "This is the work of Reverend Tull." Nora stared at him, baffled. The preacher. From the new church on the edge of town, the man was a newcomer himself. Having arrived 6 months ago with a booming voice and a collection plate, he passed with alarming frequency. He spoke of salvation and progress in the same breath, his sermons filled with fire and brimstone for the sinners and warm praise for the entrepreneurs who were building a new Jerusalem in redemption. "He's more scrivener than savior," Silas said, his voice laced with contempt. "In the capital, he was known for having the finest penmanship in the territory. He could copy any signature, draft any document, for a price. They say he sells his services by the dozen. A man needs a bill of sale backdated, a will with a new beneficiary, a land title with a slightly different border. Reverend Tull provides the paperwork, and a prayer for your soul into the bargain." The revelation settled in the room, cold and ugly. The church, the supposed house of God, was being used as a front for a forgery ring. The dummy trust Judge Mercer had warned him about it all clicked into place. Pike and Avery weren't just cheating her, they were using the veneer of piety to sanctify their crimes. As Nora processed the depth of the conspiracy, Silas picked up the forged deed from the cellar. He ran his thumb along its edge, his touch light, analytical. "They were careless," he said softly. "In a hurry." He pointed to the top right corner of the heavy paper. It had been cut, a small, diagonal slice, as if it had been trimmed from a larger sheet. Why cut the corner of a deed? Nora had no answer. It seemed a small, insignificant detail in the face of such overwhelming fraud. But Silas's eyes had a glint of the hunter in them, the man who sees the broken twig that signals the path of his prey. "Do you have any paper from the church?" he asked. "A notice, a hymn sheet." "I have a donation envelope," Nora said, rising. She went to the small writing desk in the parlor where she kept her household accounts. She returned with a thin, plain envelope. On its corner was a printed request for tithes, "In the name of the Redemption Community Chapel." Silas took it from her and laid it on the table beside the forged deed. He didn't even have to place them edge to edge. The truth was instantly, glaringly obvious. The paper stock was identical, a heavy, cream-colored vellum, far richer than typical courthouse stationery. And in the top right corner of the envelope, a small, diagonal slice had been made, perfectly mirroring the cut on the deed. It had been cut from the same sheet, with the same blade. It was a careless mistake, a small economy made by the forger, using his church's expensive paper to create his fraudulent documents. It was the thread that could unravel their entire scheme. "We have them," Nora whispered, a fragile hope blooming in her chest. "We have the paper," Silas corrected gently. "But paper can be explained away as coincidence. A jury needs more. It needs a voice. We need one honest witness who can stand up in court and speak the truth." They both knew who that had to be. "The widow Dunleavy," Nora said. "The woman who had been their first victim. The woman who, in a desperate attempt to pay her own inflated rent, had come to Nora's back door to offer her laundry services for extra coin. Nora had been in the middle of counting out her payment for Pike that day. Mrs. Dunleavy had been standing right there, a basket of folded linens in her arms. When Pike had sneered and refused to take Nora's money, she had seen it. She had heard it all. "She's terrified," Nora said, thinking of the widow's haunted eyes and trembling hands. "Avery and Pike have already taken everything from her. She won't dare speak against them." "She might," Silas countered, "if she knows she's not alone." He stood up, his decision made. "Jed," he called, his voice carrying through the quiet house. One of the young cowhands, Jed Hayes, appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes wide with concern. "Sir, I need you to ride," Silas commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Ride to the Dunleavy place, out by the old cottonwood. Find Mrs. Dunleavy. Tell her Nora Thompson needs her. Tell her it's time to stop running. Don't frighten her, but don't take no for an answer. Bring her back here. Now!" Jed nodded, his face serious, and was gone in an instant, his boots thudding down the hall. While Silas handled the external world, Nora turned to her own battlefield. The law, as Judge Mercer had said, demanded proof. Her simple, coffee-stained receipts were her ammunition. She sat down at the table, took out fresh paper, and began the laborious task of copying each one in triplicate. One copy for the judge, one for her own records, and one for Silas. Her hand, usually so steady, ached with the tension, but she did not stop. The scratching of her pen was a small, determined sound, a rhythm of defiance against the silence. For every lie in Pike's ledger, she would create 3 truths on the page. She was so absorbed in her work, in the meticulous transfer of dates and numbers, that she didn't hear the footsteps on the porch until they were right at the door. They were heavy, arrogant steps, the steps of a man who believed he owned the very ground he walked on. The door was pushed open without the courtesy of a knock. "Mr." Pike stood on her threshold, a triumphant, predatory grin stretching his thin lips. In his hand, he held a coil of the same bright red ribbon Deputy Stroud had carried, the symbol of seizure. He was not a man accustomed to being thwarted, and his eyes glittered with malice. He had come to finish the job himself. His gaze swept over the scene in the kitchen, the papers spread across the table. Nora at her work, Silas standing like a sentinel by the stove. His grin widened, becoming a sneer of pure contempt. He looked past Nora, his eyes locking onto Silas. He ignored her completely, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the house he had come to claim. He spoke directly to the tall man who stood as the only obstacle in his path. "I have a legal writ," Pike announced, his voice oozing a false sense of authority. "I'd ask that the husband step aside." The words struck Nora with the force of a physical blow. "The husband?" He had said it with a deliberate, mocking emphasis, a sneer that twisted the word into an accusation. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. He knew, somehow, in the short time they had been at the courthouse, he had learned that their marriage was a desperate sham, a legal trick, and he had come to call their bluff. The wheels of justice, Nora discovered, did not always turn in the hallowed halls of the courthouse. Sometimes they ground to a halt in the dust of Main Street. Judge Mercer, it turned out, had left that very morning on a circuit call to a neighboring county. not expected back for 2 days. Pike's challenge to the injunction, therefore, fell to the only legal authority left in redemption, the clerk, Mr. Abernathy. And Mr. Abernathy, a man who lived his life in mortal fear of procedural error, found himself facing a conundrum. Pike and his lawyer demanded an immediate hearing. Silas Boone, now legally Nora's husband, demanded the same. The crowd that had gathered outside the boarding house, their appetite for drama whetted, had followed them all to the courthouse, their numbers swelling until they spilled out onto the street. The clerk's office could barely hold 5 people, let alone a town hungry for a spectacle. There was only one room in Redemption big enough and neutral enough to accommodate them all, the Red Chute Saloon. And so, the law, in all its strange and makeshift majesty, came to the Red Chute. The proprietor, a pragmatic man named Gus, ordered the bar closed and the girls upstairs. The gamblers' tables were pushed against the walls to make room for rough wooden benches brought in from the church, an irony that was not lost on Nora. The air, usually thick with the smells of stale beer, whiskey, and sweat, was now heavy with a different kind of tension. The charged silence of a courtroom, half the town crammed inside, a jury of gossips and gawkers. Weather-beaten cowboys stood shoulder to shoulder with pale-faced seamstresses, their hands still pricked from their needles. Gamblers whose faces were normally unreadable masks now watched with open curiosity. The great, upright piano, the source of so much nightly revelry, stayed silent, its lid closed like a coffin's. Mr. Abernathy, looking deeply uncomfortable, set up a small table at the front of the room, arranging his papers and inkwell with a fussy precision that did little to hide his nervousness. Pike and Cole Avery sat at a table to the right, the picture of confident righteousness. Nora and Silas sat to the left. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the clerk. She would not look at the crowd. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "This is an informal hearing," he began, his voice thin and reedy. "To review the stay of seizure on the property known as Thompson's boarding house. Mr. Pike, you may present your claim." Pike rose, a smirk playing on his lips. He thrived on this kind of public stage. He held up his pristine, fraudulent ledger. "It's simple, folks," he said, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "The woman," he gestured to Nora without looking at her, "is insolvent, broke. She hasn't paid her rent in 3 months. I have the records right here." He slapped the ledger for emphasis. "I gave her warnings. I gave her time. But she refused to pay and she refused to leave. The law is the law." He then produced the forged deed of sale. Furthermore, 2 weeks ago, she agreed to sell the property to me to clear her debts. She signed the deed herself. He held the paper aloft, pointing to the crude X at the bottom. "Her mark is right there. But when it came time to honor the deal, she refused. Now she's hiding behind this sudden marriage to a stranger. It's a sham, a desperate trick to cheat an honest businessman out of his rightful property." A murmur went through the crowd. Pike's story was simple and, on the surface, believable. Cole Avery nodded along solemnly, a pillar of civic virtue supporting his aggrieved friend, Mrs. Boone, Abernathy said, his gaze flicking nervously toward Nora. "Your response." Nora stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply spoke the truth, her words falling into the silence like stones into a still pond. "I have never missed a payment. On the 15th of last month, I attempted to pay Mr. Pike in full, in cash. He refused to accept it." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Mrs. Dunleavy, who was present at the time, can attest to this. She placed her own bundle of receipts on the clerk's table. "These are my records. They show every payment I have made for the past 5 years, each one signed by Mr. Pike himself. You will find they contradict every number in the ledger he holds." She looked directly at Abernathy. "As for the deed of sale, I have never seen that document before in my life. I never agreed to sell my home. That is not my mark." "It is a forgery." Her statement was plain, unadorned, and delivered with the quiet force of absolute certainty. The crowd was silent now, caught between the two conflicting stories. Pike scoffed loudly, but a few of the townspeople were looking at him with a new flicker of doubt in their eyes. Then Silas stood. He did not move to the front of the room. He stood by his chair, a tall, calm presence that nonetheless drew every eye. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made every person in the room lean forward to listen. "The law is indeed the law. Mr. Pike," he began, his eyes fixed on the man. "And the law is concerned with facts, with evidence." He turned his gaze to Abernathy. "The documents presented by Mr. Pike are interesting. The penmanship is exceptionally fine. The paper is of a quality one doesn't often see in a simple rent ledger." He let the implication settle. Then he delivered the blow. "I ask the court to examine the evidence more closely. Specifically, I ask you to check the paper stock of that forged deed, and then check the blade that cut its corner." Abernathy stared at him, confused. The blade. Before Silas could explain, Cole Avery rose from his chair with a theatrical sigh of weary patience. "This is becoming a circus," he announced, his voice smooth and reasonable. He reached into his own leather satchel, the one he always carried, and began to rummage inside, while Mrs. Thompson or Mrs. Boone was making her accusations. It occurred to me that I picked something up from the floor of her pantry during the excitement this morning. I believe it may be what we are all looking for." With the flourish of a stage magician, he pulled out a ledger. It was worn, its cover slightly stained. It was Nora's real ledger. He placed it on Abernathy's desk. "It seems the lady misplaced her own records," Avery said, his expression a perfect blend of concern and mild rebuke. Perhaps if she had been more organized, this whole unfortunate misunderstanding could have been avoided. A knife-like murmur cut across the room. It was a brilliant, vicious move. By producing the ledger himself, Avery had transformed from a potential conspirator into an honest broker, a man who had simply found a lost item. He had muddied the waters, casting doubt on Nora's competence and implying she had hidden the book herself. Abernathy, now completely bewildered, opened the real ledger next to the fake one. The contrast was stark. One was the clean, neat fiction of a crime. The other was the messy, authentic record of a life. But Avery's play had an unintended consequence. It put Reverend Tull, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the saloon, on the spot. With Silas's words about paper stock still hanging in the air, the preacher knew he had to act. He rose, clearing his throat. "Mr. Abernathy," he said, his voice booming with false piety. "Perhaps I can be of assistance. Mr. Boone mentions the paper stock. Our church has recently purchased some fine new vellum for our hymnals to give proper glory to the Lord. It is of the highest quality." He produced a folded hymn sheet from his coat pocket. "Perhaps this will serve for a comparison." He handed the sheet to the clerk. It was a calculated risk. By offering the sample himself, he was feigning transparency, hoping to dismiss the similarity as coincidence. Abernathy, a man of procedure above all else, took the offering seriously. He was no expert, but he held the corner of the forged deed up to the light, then did the same with the hymn sheet. He rubbed the fibers between his thumb and forefinger. He laid the cut corner of the deed against the corner of the church's paper. The angle of the cut, the very texture of the vellum, it was not just a match. It was perfect. Too perfect. A seed of suspicion was finally planted in the clerk's cautious mind. Pike, seeing the look on Abernathy's face, sneered, "It's a coincidence. Paper is paper." Avery smirked, his confidence unshaken. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "It's called progress. Gentlemen, sometimes old things must make way for the new." The room was at a stalemate. It was paper against paper, a woman's word against two powerful men. Abernathy, paralyzed by indecision, looked as if he was about to postpone the entire matter until Judge Mercer returned. The air was thick with unresolved tension. Then the saloon doors burst open with a crash. A young ranch hand, one of the Hayes brothers who boarded at Nora's house, stood framed in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face pale with alarm. "Mr. Boone, ma'am," he gasped, pointing frantically back toward the street. "You have to come quick. It's the train men. They're here now. They're staking new markers. They're going straight through your kitchen garden." The saloon emptied in a chaotic rush, a tide of humanity spilling out from the dim, tense quiet of the hearing into the harsh, blinding glare of the afternoon. The carefully constructed legal arguments, the paper truths and paper lies, all evaporated in the face of the stark, physical reality of the ranch hand's words. Pike and Avery were no longer just waging a war of ink and ledgers. They were seizing the land itself. Nora ran, her feet so used to the familiar floorboards of her home, finding purchase on the dusty, rutted street. Silas was beside her, his long strides easily keeping pace. The crowd followed, a curious, murmuring river of townspeople drawn to the unfolding conflict. They rounded the corner and saw it. The sight was a violation, a deep and brutal wound inflicted upon the sanctuary she had so carefully tended. Her kitchen garden, the place where she grew the tomatoes and beans that fed her boarders, the small patch of green that was her private solace, was gone. In its place was a raw scar of trampled earth and a line of newly hammered wooden stakes. They gleamed with fresh, garish orange paint, each one branded with the stark, black letters RR Western Line. Parcel 14B. A crew of a half-dozen rough-looking men stood by, their expressions a mixture of sweat-stained boredom and casual hostility. In charge of them was a big, broad-shouldered man with a sunburnt neck and a contemptuous squint. He wore a dusty hat pushed back on his head and held a rolled-up blueprint in one thick hand. This was the foreman, the physical embodiment of Cole Avery's ambition. "This is private property," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm as he and Nora came to a stop at the edge of the ruined garden. "This action is under legal dispute." The foreman spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Not according to my papers," he said, his voice a low growl. He unrolled the blueprint with a snap of his wrist. Attached to it with a clip was an option agreement. "I hold the options on this parcel, signed and sealed by the trustees of the Redemption Community Chapel." The church. Again. It was the linchpin of their entire scheme. "My orders are to stake the primary survey line, and that's what I'm doing." "Let me see the original document," Silas demanded. "Not a copy." The foreman's eyes narrowed. He looked Silas up and down, taking in the well-cut coat and the air of authority that had nothing to do with blueprints or property lines. He clearly recognized a threat that was more significant than a distraught woman. "I don't have to show you anything. My orders come from the railroad's acquisitions agent, Mr. Avery. You have a problem. You take it up with him." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And two of the crew members, burly men with calloused knuckles, straightened up, subtly positioning themselves between the foreman and Silas. The threat was clear. They were done with talking. They were done with the pretense of the law. This was now a matter of force. But before Silas could respond, Nora acted. She did not shout. She did not plead. She walked, her steps deliberate and steady, across the trampled soil of her garden. She stepped over the offensive orange line of twine that connected the stakes, and she placed herself directly in its path. She turned, her back to her own porch, and faced the foreman. She planted her feet in the soil she had tilled with her own hands, a small, unmovable figure in a simple dress, and she folded her arms. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with the clarity of a bell across the tense silence. "You can measure around me." The foreman stared at her, momentarily nonplussed. He had dealt with angry men, with lawyers, with guns. He did not know what to do with a quiet, defiant woman who refused to be moved. His men shifted uncomfortably. Even the watching crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Silas seized the moment, not with a threat, but with reason. He unrolled a map he pulled from his own coat pocket, a detailed surveyor's map of the town. It was a document far more precise than the foreman's simple blueprint. He spread it on the flat top of a fence post. "There's another way. he said, his voice calm and practical, a stark contrast to the foreman's blustering. He pointed a finger at the map. The line you're staking is unnecessarily destructive. It cuts through 3 private homes, but if you shift the line 20 feet to the south, skirting the alleyway behind the properties, he traced the new path with his finger. You still make your grade. You still hit your terminus point by the creek. The company gets its line, and 3 women get to keep their homes. It is a better, more efficient route. The foreman glanced at the map. A flicker of interest in his eyes quickly suppressed. He was a practical man. He could see the logic in what Silas proposed. But his orders were not based on logic. He shrugged, straightening up and rolling his own blueprint tight. Makes no difference to me. I got my orders. The route is the route. He looked past them, a new arrogance in his voice. My business here is with Mr. Pike. He's the one who assured us this parcel would be clear. They were at an impasse, trading proposals in the dust and the blinding glare of the sun. The crowd murmured, shifting their weight, the novelty of the confrontation beginning to wear off. Nothing would move the man. He was a wall, built of stubbornness and someone else's greed. Silas looked at the foreman, then at Nora, standing like a statue in the path of the stakes, then at the impassive faces of the crew. He had exhausted reason. It was time for a different kind of authority. Fine, Silas said, his voice suddenly sharp, decisive. If you won't listen to reason, and you won't abide by a court-ordered injunction, then let's fetch the sheriff. We'll see what he has to say about you trespassing in defiance of a judge's stay. That was the one phrase that broke through the foreman's wall of indifference. The man's confidence faltered for the first time. The sheriff meant reports. It meant official questions from men who were not on Cole Avery's payroll. It meant trouble that could travel all the way back to the railroad's head office. He stalled, looking for a way out. The sheriff's got no say in a railroad survey. He started to bluster, but his own words lacked conviction. And then he made his mistake. As his mind raced, his gaze twitched, a flickering, involuntary movement, away from Silas and Nora, past the crowd, toward the distant steeple of the new church on the edge of town. It was a glance that lasted no more than a second, but in that second, he revealed everything. His true master was not a railroad corporation in a distant city. It was the man in that church. Guilt, clear and undeniable, showed on his face. Just at that moment, a horse came clattering down the street. It was Jed, the young cowhand, and seated behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pale and terrified, but her jaw set with a grim resolution, was the widow Dunleavy. She slid off the horse, her worn boots sinking into the dust. She saw Nora standing alone in her garden, facing down the crew of rough men, and something inside her seemed to shift. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of the same defiant fire that burned in Nora. Silas saw her. He saw the foreman's revealing glance. He saw Nora's unyielding stance. All the pieces were on the board. He looked at Nora, a silent question, a shared strategy passing between them in a single, intense look. They could not fight this war on one front alone. They had to split their forces, to attack the conspiracy at its root and its branch simultaneously. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to the foreman. You stay right here. I am going to get the sheriff. Without another word. He turned and began striding purposefully toward the courthouse. Nora watched him go. Then she turned her gaze to the widow Dunleavy, who had come to stand beside her. The two women looked at each other. One who had already lost everything, and one who was about to. A bond of shared grievance and newfound courage formed between them in the dusty afternoon light. Nora looked toward the church steeple, the source of the rot that was poisoning her town. Her voice was quiet, but it held the hard certainty of steel. Mrs. Dunleavy, she said. Come with me. Where are we going? The widow whispered, her eyes wide. We, Nora replied, stepping over the orange survey line and leaving her garden behind, are going to have a talk with the Reverend. The walk to the church was not long, but it felt like a journey across a vast and desolate landscape. Nora and the widow Dunleavy walked side by side, two solitary figures moving against the tide of townspeople who were still clustered around the ruined garden, buzzing with the excitement of the confrontation. The two women said nothing. There was nothing to say. A lifetime of fear and intimidation had been burned away in the last hour, leaving behind a hard, cold resolve. Mrs. Dunleavy, who had been a ghost of a woman, a creature of trembling hands and downcast eyes, now walked with her head held high, a terrible, quiet strength in her slight frame. The Redemption Community. Chapel was not an old building. It had been built quickly, with fresh sawn pine that still wept sap in the afternoon heat. It was a place of loud sermons and even louder collection plates, a monument to a faith that felt as raw and new as the lumber it was built from. They pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine, beeswax, and something else, something cloying and false. Slanting afternoon light cut through the tall, plain glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, lost souls. The church was empty, save for one man. Reverend Tull sat in the front pew, his back to them. He was not praying. A half-empty bottle of brown whiskey stood on the floor beside him. He did not seem to have heard them enter. Rows of new hymnals were stacked neatly on a nearby table, not for the congregation, but piled high like a barricade of piety, a wall of printed psalms meant to hold the ugly truth at bay. Nora walked down the central aisle, the sound of her worn boots a steady, rhythmic intrusion in the sacred quiet. She did not walk as if to a pew to pray. She walked as if she were marching on a battlefield. Mrs. Dunleavy followed a few steps behind, her presence a silent, unwavering shadow of support. Nora stopped at the pulpit, the very place where Tull preached of damnation and salvation. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the forged deed, the lie that had almost cost her everything. She did not slam it down. She placed it gently on the open Bible that lay on the lectern, covering the holy words with its profane text. Reverend Tull finally turned, startled. His face, usually florid and confident, was pale and slick with sweat. His eyes, which boomed with righteous fire on Sundays, were now shifty and weak. He saw Nora, then Mrs. Dunleavy, and a flicker of pure panic crossed his face. He made to stand, to summon the blustering authority that was his stock in trade. But Nora spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She asked a single, simple question, her tone devoid of anger, filled only with a terrible, piercing clarity. Whose salvation costs widows? The question struck the preacher with the force of a physical blow. All the air went out of him. He visibly deflated, sinking back onto the pew. He began to sweat profusely, dabbing at his forehead with a trembling hand. His eyes slid away, unable to meet hers, darting around the empty church as if seeking an escape route from his own conscience. I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Boone, he stammered, his grand, booming voice reduced to a hoarse, frightened whisper. I am a man of God. I only do the Lord's work. He was fumbling for his lies, for the comfortable cloak of his hypocrisy. But he would not find it. Not today. Mrs. Dunleavy stepped forward, moving to stand beside Nora. She looked directly at the cowering preacher, her gaze clear and unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was as steady and certain as a church bell ringing on a clear morning. She spoke 4 simple words that shattered the last of his defenses. I saw you sign. Reverend Tull sagged as if his spine had turned to dust. A low, wretched sound, half sob and half groan, escaped his lips. The lie was broken. The truth was in the room, and it was suffocating him. He reached for the whiskey bottle, his hand shaking so violently that he knocked it over. It rolled across the floorboards with a hollow, lonely sound, and then lay still. The bottle had stopped rolling, and so had he. He stared at the spilled whiskey, a dark stain spreading on the clean pine floor, for a long, silent moment. Then, with the slow, heavy movements of a man already condemned, he rose. He walked to a small table near the altar, a table that held not a Bible, but a heavy, locked ledger. He took a key from his pocket and opened a drawer beneath it. He did not speak. He simply began to remove the contents, placing them on the table one by one. They were the unholy sacraments of his trade. Other ledgers, their pages filled with his elegant, damning script, sticks of sealing wax in various colors, a small, wicked-looking knife with a distinctively shaped blade, and a collection of cut paper corners, the scraps of evidence from his forgeries. Finally, he brought out a heavy, circular piece of brass. It was a stamped die, intricately carved, the official seal of the county clerk. He had everything he needed to create a perfect, legal lie. He turned to face them, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He looked from Nora's unforgiving face to Mrs. Dunleavy's righteous one, and he began to whisper the names, the poison finally being drawn from the wound. Pike came to me first. He said it was just business, clearing the way for the railroad. The names came out, a miserable, mumbled torrent of truth. Then Avery. He planned it all. He had the maps. He chose the properties. He took a shuddering breath. The foreman, Harris, he's on Avery's payroll. He was told to ignore any protests. Tull's eyes squeezed shut, as if he could not bear to speak the final name. And one more. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a desperate, pleading terror. Deputy Stroud. He was the one who told Pike your husband was a stranger. He overheard you at the courthouse. He gets a share for looking the other way, for ensuring the law arrived a day too late. The final piece clicked into place. The trap had been closing from all sides. Tull clasped his hands together, a grotesque parody of prayer. Mercy, he begged, his voice cracking. Please, I will tell them everything. I will testify. I'll give you the stamp, the ledgers, everything. Just don't let them send me to the territorial prison. Nora felt no pity, only a cold, hard sense of purpose. You will come with us now, Reverend, she said, her voice like ice, and you will tell your story to the whole town. The walk back to the Red Chute Saloon was a strange and silent procession. The broken preacher shuffled between the two women, a captive escorted not by the law, but by his victims. They were no longer victims. They were agents of justice. When they pushed open the saloon doors, the room fell instantly silent. The crowd, which had been buzzing with speculation, stared in stunned disbelief. Mr. Abernathy was still at his table, trying to make sense of the conflicting ledgers. Pike and Avery were conferring in low, confident tones. Deputy Stroud stood by the door, his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. Then he saw Reverend Tull, and the color drained from his face. Nora and Mrs. Dunleavy escorted the preacher to the front of the room. Tull, his eyes fixed on the floor, began to speak. He did not confess to the town. He confessed to Nora, his voice a miserable mumble that was nonetheless audible in the dead silence. He told them everything, the forgery, the conspiracy, the names. When he whispered the name Deputy Stroud, a collective gasp went through the room. Stroud did not wait to hear more. He was a cornered animal. With a choked cry of panic, he lunged for the door, shoving people out of his way in a desperate bid for freedom. He never made it. The saloon doors were suddenly blocked by two figures. Silas Boone, his face grim as a thundercloud, and behind him, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Miller. He had a shotgun cradled in his arm, and his eyes were like chips of cold, hard granite. Stroud froze, his hand on the door, his face a mask of pure terror. He was caught. The room erupted in a cacophony of shouts and accusations. Pike leapt to his feet, his face purple with rage, screaming that it was all lies. Mr. Abernathy stared, his mouth agape, at the utter collapse of legal order. Through it all, one man remained perfectly still. Cole Avery had not moved from his chair. He had listened to the entire confession without a single change in his expression. As the sheriff stepped forward to put the cuffs on a whimpering Deputy Stroud, Avery was the only person in the entire room who was smiling. He looked directly at Silas, his smile thin and chilling, filled with a certainty that transcended the chaos of the room. This changes nothing. "Boone," he said, his voice calm and conversational, yet carrying over the din. "You've won a little skirmish with some local fools." He gave a dismissive wave toward Pike and Tull. "But the war is already over. The real contracts, the master deeds for this entire right-of-way, already sit in an office in Cheyenne. They are filed, they are legal, and they are backed by men with rails and soldiers to protect them. By nightfall, the Red Chute Saloon had undergone a strange and solemn metamorphosis. The arrival of Judge Mercer, weary from his ride but his eyes missing nothing, had imposed an immediate and unassailable gravity upon the room. Gus, the proprietor, had worked with a quiet efficiency, clearing the central floor. The gamblers' tables were pushed together to form one long, imposing bench, a makeshift judge's bench, straight-backed chairs, borrowed from the very church that had served as the conspiracy's heart, were arranged in neat, orderly rows. Bibles were brought from the courthouse, not for comfort, but for the swearing of oaths. The air, scrubbed of its usual whiskey-soaked revelry, was thick with the scent of lamp oil and the electric tension of a final reckoning. The saloon had become a courtroom proper, a sanctuary of the law carved out of a den of vice. Judge Mercer began without preamble. He sat at the long table. The full weight of the territory's authority settled upon his broad shoulders. He called for the evidence. The process was methodical, a slow and careful reconstruction of the truth, piece by damning piece. First came the paper. In the steady, unwavering lamplight, the judge examined the fibers of the forged deed and the hymn sheet Reverend Tull had provided. He used his own spectacles, then a magnifying glass from his satchel. The silence in the room was so profound that the faint rasp of the vellum under his fingertips was audible. "The paper stock is identical," he declared, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. He took the small, wicked blade from Tull's collection of tools and the cut corner of the deed. He laid it against the hymn sheet, and this corner was cut from this stock, with the ghost of the same blade. The marks align. Next, the ink. He compared the entries in Pike's fraudulent ledger with the known, authenticated script of Reverend Tull. He did not need to be an expert. The elegant, self-assured loops and flourishes were as unique as a fingerprint. Then came the voices. Reverend Tull, under a solemn oath sworn on a Bible his own hands had profaned, repeated his confession. This time, it was not the mumbled, desperate plea of a cornered man, but a formal testimony. His words recorded by Mr. Abernathy, whose pen scratched furiously across the page. Tull's account of the dates he was paid, the documents he was asked to create, matched Nora's coffee-stained receipts and the widow Dunleavy's timeline of harassment and eviction perfectly. The chain of evidence was being forged, link by unbreakable link. The first crack in the conspirators' wall of silence came not from the mastermind, but from the weakest link. Judge Mercer fixed his gaze on Deputy Stroud, who stood in the custody of Sheriff Miller, his face the color of wet ash. "Deputy," the judge began, his voice deceptively mild, "you took an oath to uphold the law in this county. Reverend Tull has implicated you in a conspiracy to defraud its citizens. Your badge is a hair's breadth from being stripped, and you are a moment away from a long stay in the territorial prison. I suggest you consider your next words with extreme care." Stroud, a man of weak character and weaker loyalties, crumbled. He had built his life on the small authority of his badge, and the thought of losing it, of being cast out and caged, was more than he could bear. His eyes darted toward Avery, who watched him with an expression of pure, cold contempt. There would be no help from that quarter. Stroud was on his own. "It was Avery," he choked out, the words tumbling over each other in his haste to save himself. "It was all Avery. He said it was just business. He said the law was just a tool for men smart enough to use it." To prove his desperate sincerity, he reached inside his own coat, his hands shaking. "He wrote me a letter, a private letter, about how to handle any complications." He produced a folded piece of paper and handed it to the sheriff, who passed it to the judge. Mercer unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents. A grim, hard line formed on his mouth. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching townspeople. "Mr. Avery writes to the deputy," the judge announced, his voice ringing with cold fury. "Do not concern yourself with the sentimental claims of these women. Progress is a flood, and you cannot fence a flood. You can only make sure you are standing on the highest ground when the water rises." A low, angry murmur rippled through the saloon. The words, so cynical and predatory, laid bare the cold heart of the entire scheme. It was not about progress. It was about drowning others to get to higher ground. The judge then called the railroad foreman, Harris, to the table. The man's blustering confidence from the garden was gone, replaced by a sullen, sweating fear. Under the judge's piercing gaze and the weight of a sworn oath, his loyalty to Avery dissolved. "Mr. Harris," the judge asked, "these orders to stake a line directly through Mrs. Boone's property, did they come from the RR Western Line's head office in Omaha?" Harris swallowed hard. "No, sir. Did they come from their official territorial acquisitions office in Cheyenne?" "No, sir." "Then who, precisely, gave you the order to run that line and to ignore any and all legal protests?" The foreman's eyes flickered to Cole Avery. "The orders came from Mr. Avery. He said he was the railroad's sole agent for this parcel. He said the paperwork was all taken care of." "And the alternate route," Silas interjected, stepping forward. "The one that skirts the alleyway? Would the railroad still make its grade?" Harris hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. It would keep the grade." It was over. The lies had all been stripped away. The conspiracy was laid bare for the entire town to see. Judge Mercer leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He was no longer just a judge. He was an instrument of justice. And his words fell like a blacksmith's hammer on hot iron, shaping the future of everyone in the room. "First," he declared, his voice resonating with absolute authority, "the writ of seizure filed by Mr. Pike is hereby declared null and void, having been procured through fraudulent means." Pike let out a strangled cry of protest, which was silenced by a single sharp glare from the sheriff. "Second, a permanent injunction is placed against any seizure or harassment related to this false debt. Indictments for conspiracy, fraud, and perjury are to be drawn up immediately for Mr. Pike, the Reverend Tull, and Deputy Stroud." He paused, his gaze landing like a physical weight on Cole Avery. "And for Mr. Cole Avery. Third," the judge continued, "the title to the boarding house is fully and legally restored to its rightful owner." He looked at Nora, and for the first time, a glimmer of something approaching a smile touched his eyes. "And this court officially enters and recognizes the homestead attachment of said property as belonging to Mrs. Eleanora Boone, lawful wife of Silas Boone. Your claim is now lawful and shield strong." A quiet sigh of relief and vindication went through the room. It was a complete and total victory, but Avery was not a man who accepted defeat. As the sheriff moved toward him, Avery raised a hand, not in surrender, but to command silence. He stood, his smile returning, as confident and chilling as ever. He was playing his last card. He looked past the judge, past Silas, his eyes settling on Nora. He addressed the whole room, his voice a model of magnanimity and power. "It seems there has been a great deal of misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "My only goal has ever been to secure a clear path for the railroad, for the good of this entire town. To prove my good faith and to put this unfortunate matter to rest, I will make you an offer, Mrs. Boone. Right here, in front of everyone, I will buy your property. Not at its current value, not at double its value. I will pay you 5 times what it is worth, in cash. Today. A small fortune, enough for you to start a new life, anywhere you choose." It was a breathtakingly arrogant move, a public attempt to prove his point that everything and everyone had a price. He was trying to buy back his reputation, to turn his public condemnation into a simple business negotiation. The room went silent, every eye turning to Nora. He was offering her an escape, a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. Nora stood slowly. She did not look at the money in his eyes, or the power. She looked at the man who had tried to destroy her, who had called her life and her home an obstacle to be washed away in a flood. She thought of her years of hard work, of the smell of her own kitchen, of the simple dignity of her own sign hanging over her own porch. She spoke one simple sentence, her voice clear and steady. And it was that sentence, more than the judge's verdict or the sheriff's shotgun, that finally broke his grin. Not for sale at any number? Avery's smile faltered, then vanished completely. Replaced by a mask of cold, reptilian fury, he had been beaten, not just in law, but in spirit, in front of the entire town, and outside, as if in response to her final, defiant words. The night answered. A low, guttural growl of thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the very foundations of the saloon. Another followed, closer this time, a crack that split the sky. The wind began to howl, rattling the windows in their frames. The storm, which had been threatening all evening, was about to break. The dry creek would not be dry for long. Out in Nora's garden, the cheap orange paint on the survey stakes gleamed in a sudden flash of lightning, waiting for a flood of their own, a flash flood of real water, come to wash the lies and the liars away. Dawn broke not with a fiery announcement, but with a quiet, pearly light that seemed to wash the world clean. The storm had passed, its fury spent, leaving behind a land scoured and renewed. Nora stood on her porch, a warm mug of coffee cradled in her hands, and breathed in the cool, damp air. It smelled of wet earth, of clean pine, of a world given a second chance. The sky was a soft, pale blue, scrubbed free of every trace of dust and deceit. She looked toward the creek. Yesterday, it had been a dry, dusty scar on the landscape. This morning, it was a proper creek again, a wide, brown ribbon of water that chuckled and gurgled as it flowed. The flash flood, a force of nature as powerful and cleansing as the truth that had been spoken in the saloon, had done its work. It had risen in the night, and it had eaten the lies. The garish orange survey stakes, the false markers of Avery's greed, were gone. Every last one of them had been torn from the earth and washed away. But the alleyway, the small, humble path behind her house and the widow Dunleavy's, remained intact. The flood had known the difference between what was false and what was true. The town of redemption was waking to a new reality. Across the street, Pike's Emporium was shuttered, its windows dark and lifeless. A hastily scrawled closed sign was tacked to the door, a final, pathetic admission of defeat. Later that morning, she saw Deputy Stroud, no, just Stroud, now riding out of town on a horse, his hands bound in front of him, a grim-faced Sheriff Miller riding alongside. He did not look back, and at the new chapel on the edge of town, a solitary figure was on his hands and knees on the front steps. It was Reverend Tull, a bucket of soapy water beside him, scrubbing the wooden planks with a furious, desperate energy, as if he could somehow wash away the stain of his sins with simple lye and elbow grease. He wore the frown of a man beginning a long and arduous penance. Sheriff Miller, true to his word, had tacked a notice to the public board outside the courthouse. Nora had walked down to see it herself. The paper was crisp and official. The indictments were posted in clear, black ink for all the world to see. Pike, Tull, Stroud, and Avery, charged with conspiracy and fraud. The court date was set for 30 days hence. The wheels of justice, once clogged with lies, were now turning steady and true. Nora returned to her boarding house with a sense of purpose she had not felt in weeks. She retrieved her sign, the one Silas had carefully set against the porch wall. The slashed rope hung from it like a broken promise. She cut it away. She took out her small pots of paint, black and white, and with a steady hand, she began to restore the letters. Room's supper. This was her life, her work, her name. As she painted, she added one final word, a declaration of her own resilience. Open. The work was simple, satisfying. Inside, the morning routine had resumed its comforting rhythm. The Hayes brothers and Mr. Henderson were at the kitchen table, their quiet conversation a welcome murmur of normalcy. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, and steam from the kettle fogged the kitchen windows, misting the panes like a soft curtain between the world outside and the sanctuary within. She was just finishing the last letter when a shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was Silas. He was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands, his posture one of quiet, formal respect. He looked different in the clean morning light. The hard, dangerous edge of the river byre was gone, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. He looked like a man standing on unfamiliar ground. He set a steaming mug of coffee on the porch stoop, a peace offering. "The judge filed the paperwork this morning," he said, his voice low. "The injunction is permanent. The homestead attachment is secure. You're safe." "Thanks to you," Nora replied, her voice equally quiet. She set down her paintbrush. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. Nora, you and Mrs. Dunleavy. All I did was open a door." He paused, his gaze fixed on the hat he was turning over and over in his hands. "Our bargain is fulfilled. The 30 days, they're not necessary now. I spoke with Judge Mercer. He can have the marriage annulled this afternoon, quietly. No one needs to know. It can be as if it never happened. The bargain can end today if you wish." He was offering her an escape, just as Avery had. But this offer was not of money or a new life somewhere else. It was an offer of her old life, her independence, her name, everything she had been fighting for. She looked at him, at this stranger who had stood with her, who had forged a lie to help her find the truth. She thought of his hand, warm and steady on hers in the judge's office. She thought of the shield his name had given her, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she no longer wanted to be just Eleanora Thompson. She looked down at her work, at the freshly painted sign that declared her business, her home to be open. Open for business, open for what came next. "Some vows start as paperwork," she said, her voice soft but clear in the still morning air. "Then they learn to breathe." Silas looked up, his hands finally stilling on the brim of his hat. A slow, dawning comprehension filled his eyes, a light that was more powerful than the morning sun. He understood. He took a step up onto the porch, then another, until he was standing before her. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion and relief around his eyes. He smelled of clean soap and the fresh, rain-washed morning. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. The moment was too new, too fragile for that. Instead, he reached out and gently took the sign from her hands. His fingers brushing against hers, he turned and looked at the porch rail, the one Martha Gable and the other gossips had leaned on to watch her eviction. It was loose. He tested it with his hand, then, with a simple, practical motion, he set himself to fixing it, pushing the post back into place, securing it with a firm, steady pressure. It was a small, domestic act, the act of a man who was not leaving, the act of a man who was beginning to build something. "I smell bacon," he said, a faint, real smile finally touching his lips. He stayed for breakfast. Later that day, as Nora was hanging her newly repaired sign, she saw a flicker of movement down Main Street. It was the railroad crew, but they were no longer in her garden. They were working by the alleyway, 20 feet to the south, hammering in new stakes, their bright orange paint a symbol not of theft, but of honest compromise. They were shifting the line, just like the map. The day passed in a haze of quiet work and peaceful routine. Night fell, and the house was calm. Her boarders were asleep upstairs. Nora sat in her parlor, mending a shirt, the rhythmic pull of the needle a comforting, familiar sound. Her life, which had been a whirlwind of chaos and fear, had found its center again. It was different now, quieter, but stronger. A knock came at the door. It was not the hard, demanding knock of a man come to collect a debt. It was not the sharp, impatient rap of the law. It was a gentle knock, hesitant, almost questioning. She put down her sewing and went to the door, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. She opened it. The same man stood on her porch, framed by the soft, yellow lamplight from the hall. It was the same door, but this time he held no writ in his hand. His hands were empty. His stormy eyes were filled with a quiet, hopeful light, and he spoke 4 quiet words, words that were not a bargain, or a legal trick, or a strategy. They were a question, a plea, and a promise. All at once, 4 words that felt like a sunrise. Home, if you'll keep me. Thank you for listening to this Wild West story. If you enjoyed it, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support us, hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.